Now we'd like to start the session two, the role of global financial safety net. So first of all, we'd like to invite the moderator and the panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome them with a big round of applause to the stage. Would you please come up to the stage? Thank you so much. We will be able to think about the role of financial safety nets and what we should be protecting through this session, we believe. And before I hand off the microphone, I'd like to inform our panelists and the presenters on stage. Please take the podium as you just give your presentation. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Now please allow me to introduce the moderator for this session. We'll have the President of Global Solutions Initiative, Dennis Snowa. So Dennis, would you please begin the session? I would like to hand over the microphone. Yes, you can just proceed the session sitting on the chair, and our presenters will take the podium. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted and honored to be chair of this great session. We've got a great lineup of speakers and panelists about a terribly important subject that picks up the implications of the subject matter that was discussed this morning. And we will be focusing on the global financial safety net, which traditionally involves countries' international reserves, bilateral swap arrangements among central banks, regional financial arrangements, IMF, and similar institutional support. And the question that we will be asking here is how well does this global financial safety net operate in the light of the problems that we face and that have been repeated a number of times this morning. The problem of indebtedness, particularly of poorer and developing countries. And in addition, we will be considering issues of governance of international financial institutions, not only in supplying short-term liquidity, but also in asking whether this governance structure could be reformed in order to better fulfill the functions that a global financial safety net can be expected to fulfill, both in terms of representation as well as the financial capacity and the financing methods of the financial institutions underlying the global financial safety net. I'd like to start out by mentioning one thing that I think is striking with regard to the discussion so far, which is what all the different contributions had in common was that they were at a very macro level. Aggregate inflation, aggregate output, and many of the problems that we address are actually micro problems. When we talk about, say, energy or food shortages, we talk of energy and food shortages for the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable countries. And therefore, one thing that I'd like to bring into the discussion concerning the global financial safety net is whether we can deal with both issues, the macro issues in terms of macro stability that is provided by the safety net, but also on how this safety net can be adjusted to actually meet the micro needs that underlie many of our problems. And let me give you one example. It is more than probable, at least in my opinion, that with the Ukraine war and its aftermath, supply chains will, to some degree, decouple, and they will decouple along political lines. And that decoupling, along with a readjustment of supply chains to take into account environmental targets and more resilience, will require investment. Whenever there are a new set of supply chains that need to be formed in order to be more resilient, say, to political and other macroeconomic shocks, investment needs to take place. And investment can take place best when interest rates are low, but now we are in an environment of rising interest rates. And so the question that I'd like to ask is, with regard to short-term issues of short-term stagflation, short-term inflation, to what degree do we need tight monetary policy, and to what degree can tighter fiscal policy, where there is more latitude perhaps to fine-tune it, to target it at preserving the needs and purposes of vulnerable people, to what degree can fiscal policy take over some of the load? And one last question I'd like to ask before handing it over to our prominent speakers is, with regard to inflation generally, I think the underlying assumption has been that regarding global inflation, this lies largely in the hands of the large central banks of important advanced industrialized countries, and emerging and developing countries are adjusting to that. The question that I ask myself is, will these large advanced countries that are setting inflation targets implicitly find themselves facing a very difficult choice as inflation rises? The choice between stabilizing inflation and stabilizing the financial system. Because as interest rates rise, one would expect that the probability of financial instabilities rises, and should these instabilities become prominent, in the absence of enough well-developed macroprudential measures, which do not, in my opinion, exist currently, central banks will need to make a choice. And if they choose to preserve the financial system, then we lose an inflation anchor. If they choose to stabilize prices, then we may have a problem on the financial front. So it would be good to include this in the conversation as well. Okay, without further ado, I'd now like to introduce our speakers and our discussants as we go along. I'd like our speakers to restrict themselves to 15 to 20 minutes of presentation, and the discussants to 10 to maximally 15 minutes, depending on how we go. Our first speaker is Alan Taylor from the University of California, Davis. He does not require any introduction. He is well known to us all as a distinguished professor at his university, an associate at NBER and a fellow at CPR. I don't want to take up your time by citing more and more out of your CV, and instead hand over to you, Alan. We're very interested in your remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis, for the brief introduction and kind thoughts. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank our hosts, the Ministry of Economy and Finance and the KDI for the kind invitation to speak in this session. My remit was to speak about monetary policy spillovers, financial stability, and the trilemma. And since not everyone in the audience is obsessive about international macro and finance, I possibly ought to explain what the trilemma is. It's the tension between three policy goals: fixed exchange rates, free mobility of capital, and autonomous monetary policy. And that's been an active area of research for me, going back to a paper I wrote with Maury Obstfeld back in 1997. And I well remember sitting in Maury's office at Berkeley as we were drawing up this paper and pulling down from the bookshelf the Oxford English Dictionary, 2-volume set, compact edition, with magnifying glass, to check. And so I said to Maury, is this a word? Maybe we should check if it's a word. Turns out it is a word. And it also turns out that Milton Friedman beat us to the punch and actually used this word back in the 1950s, but only in a draft manuscript of his famous paper on the case for flexible exchange rates. And there it remained buried for years and eventually was found in the Stanford archives maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So then we discovered we weren't quite as original as we thought we were. So that started a train of papers with colleagues and co-authors over the subsequent 25 years. And so it's nice to be here with Maury on this anniversary, and perhaps like any anniversary, we're due for some moments of introspection, reflection on what we've learned, and how, or even whether, there are some relevant lessons for today. Now, we're clearly in the midst of what is the first large global cycle of interest rate hikes since the mid-2000s, possibly the largest since the Volcker era. And one big question is, how will this channel through US monetary policy and transmit to the rest of the world, and especially emerging markets? And the trilemma provides a natural framework to try to answer this question. But the trilemma has also come under scrutiny recently, and notably in the so-called dilemma view, the role of the exchange rate regime is downplayed, chopping off or at least sanding down one of the corners of the trilemma. So this presentation will review some evidence and insights from the last 2 decades of research, and argue that maybe the implications of the trilemma are very different for DMs versus EMs, and also when shocks are local versus global or common. And I will end up by arguing that I think the exchange rate regime is still a very important mediator of spillovers from US monetary and financial shocks. So the framing for my presentation is the question, has the death of the trilemma been exaggerated? And skeptical members of the audience may already be able to guess that that's a bit of a rhetorical question. And so in the time available, I want to touch on 3 main topics. First, the question of necessary versus sufficient conditions. The idea that even if an open floating exchange rate regime country can exert monetary autonomy, it may choose not to do so. It may not want to do so under some circumstances, which muddies our inferences about whether the trilemma holds. And we're back here to the question of global versus common shocks, a central plank in things like optimum currency area ideas and other problems and theories in international finance. So there I'll look at the experience of the last two Fed hiking cycles to try and bring that into sharper focus. Second, I want to go into the dilemma view a little bit, the alternative view, and make a few points as to why that view is often exaggerated, perhaps even beyond the intentions of its inventors. For example, only in an extreme case would the trilemma mean that an open floating exchange rate country would perfectly insulate against all shocks. For example, it would be kind of a corner solution, an opposite extreme to the hardest peg, with no other spillovers being contemplated, and a central bank with perfect information and able to exploit its full powers and enjoy the divine coincidence. Well, there were a lot of conditions there. Good luck finding that in the real world, as opposed to in a theoretical model. In practice, the trilemma can only say that an open float should be more insulated than an open peg, a matter of degree, not a binary prescription. So I'll talk a little bit about why that's important, and also how it might differ between DM and EM countries. Third and finally, where are we now? I want to touch on some recent research and even discuss some new results, suggesting that empirically the trilemma is in fact still very relevant for EM economies, both as a mediator of US monetary policy shocks and financial shocks. So let me turn to recent experience as a framing for what follows. And here you see, since the late 1990s, we've seen 4 Fed hiking cycles. I'm showing the Fed funds rate and the 6-month yield, because I'm going to use the 6-month yield in an exercise a little later. The late 90s cycle ended with a stock market crash, a recession. The mid-2000s cycle ended with a housing and a stock market crash and a depression. And the two most recent hiking cycles are 2016 to 18, which ended with a reversal as the economy slowed and markets fell, and now 21-22, which is ongoing in the face of mostly supply-driven global inflation shocks, driven by post-COVID supply chain problems, the oil and gas price spikes after Russia launched a war against Ukraine, but also having some sources in the US at least with some substantial fiscal components. Now, looking just at these last two cycles, a natural test of the trilemma might be to ask, okay, we've seen these two cycles of hiking, how did it play out in emerging markets? And here I'm going to use BIS policy rates. And first, episode 1, well, it's actually, the most recent episode, what we're going through now, there is not an especially strong negative correlation to suggest any insulation of floats. So here on the vertical axis is the change in the country's policy rate during that hiking cycle of 21-22, and this goes, I think, through July, so there's more hiking after that. And along the horizontal axis is the exchange rate regime classification of Ilzetsky, Reinhardt, and Rogoff, which is categorical from 1 to 15. And here, low means peg at 1, and high at 15 means floating. And I think you can see here there's very clearly no correlation. It's actually a slight positive correlation, but it's not statistically significant. And that goes back to what Charles Engels said, that there's obviously a lot of variation here in outcomes in the recent hiking cycle. Different emerging markets are hiking to different degrees, and that reflects all kinds of domestic conditions and different degrees of pass-through and so forth, and exposure to different commodities that are imported. But what this picture is saying is that heterogeneity is in no way associated with the exchange rate regime. Right? It's associated with other things, but not their choice of exchange rate regime. And my first point would be, is that defying the trilemma? Well, no, because floats having autonomy, which is unobservable, is not the same as floats using autonomy, which is observable. Right? So theory would tell us that a global common shock, one that hits both floats and pegs and base countries equally, would induce the same optimal response in all cases. And it wouldn't necessarily operate in a different way across pegs and floats. There may be other heterogeneity, but it would be orthogonal. And so that's kind of the story of the recent cycle. We've got a global common shock, but it's not something that particularly elicits different responses across pegs and floats. Well, I think you can see how we're going to be set up here. When we go back to the last cycle of Fed hiking in 2016, 2018, we get a very different picture. Right? We see now that the floats were more isolated, the correlation is negative and significant, and whilst the harder pegs had to raise their rates in keeping with the Fed, there was much more dispersion and differentiation in the floating rate economies. So that reflected, very different points in the business cycle. The US was recovering at a medium pace. Europe was recovering at a slower pace from the global financial crisis, but emerging markets were maybe further along, hadn't suffered as much. It was a very asynchronized period in the global cycle, and countries had different objectives, and when they were able to express that in a floating rate regime, they were expressing it. So theory would say here, okay, that was a global, not a local shock. Sorry, this was a world of local shocks, not the common shock, which we've seen in the recent period. And so this ought to be a scenario in which the trilemma bites with more force, and it appears that it did. Okay, so to summarize, what I'm trying to point out here in the first part of the discussion are some of the caveats in the application of the trilemma to real-world situations and the perils of empirical validation. Most obviously, the real world is not binary, as in the simplest version of the trilemma theory. There are intermediate exchange rate regimes, intermediate capital control regimes, intermediate degrees of desired monetary policy autonomy. So in these circumstances, the trilemma in and of itself will not exactly predict how exchange rate correlations will turn out unconditionally at all times and in small samples. And most importantly, it will depend on the nature of the shocks, whether they're local or global, and every shock is likely to be a mix of the two, making trouble for empiricists. Identification is not straightforward, and we won't exactly get the clean, natural or quasi-natural experiment that we want each and every time. So, turning back to more historical evidence, and we obviously need a larger sample so that these average responses we see will start to smooth out some of the idiosyncrasies in particular periods. This is the textbook evidence, literally, from my textbook, showing what we would expect. For open pegs in panel A, the correlation between their own interest rate and the base rate is strongly statistically significant. It's a little bit less than 1, but it is very strong. For open floats, not so much, not statistically significant, and for closed economies, even less. Now, in these pictures, these are still unconditional correlations. We can't control in this situation for whether shocks are global or local. And probably even if we had those controls, there'd be multiple other things that we couldn't control for as well. But in my work with Maury and with Jay, we've shown that this kind of outcome here is quite consistent with a benchmark model of exchange rate regimes where a typical fixed exchange rate country is not a hard peg. It has some kind of a band, so there's some give and take on the edge. It's more of a managed float or a dirty peg. And there you would expect a pass-through of interest rates from the base to the local economy that is less than 1, but maybe be around 0.5 or a little bit higher. So that part of the historical evidence over a much larger sample is giving you a sense that the trilemma does have some bite. And the other aspect of the textbook presentation here again is to draw out the implications for the real economy. And this draws on Jay's later work, where we see sort of impulse responses for output in pegs and floats using crude bins for fixed and floating exchange rate regimes. And here again, there's a sense that the exchange rate regime matters a lot. Base country interest rate hikes are the treatment here, and that treatment results in responses that are fairly benign in floating exchange rate regimes, the blue bars, whereas in fixed exchange rate regimes, when the base hikes, it tends to be transmitted to a recession in the local economy. And again, this is a large sample result, so we can have a little bit more confidence in that. Let me turn now to the dilemma versus trilemma conflict and the research of the last decade, which has focused heavily on the ways in which shocks transmit from the US to other advanced economies. And that goes back to Ellen Ray's famous paper at Jackson Hole, Dilemma versus Trilemma. And here are some more recent results in that vein from a recent paper, working paper by De Gasperi, Hong, and Rico, using longer and broader panel data to make a similar point. And this is, as the title says, a picture of median responses in advanced economies. These are like local projections, so they're kind of average treatment effects. That's what a local projection is. And it's saying, for a monetary policy shock, how are these transmitted to the other advanced economies from the US? And the answer is there's a strong response. And that is suggestive of a dilemma scenario, because of course most of these other advanced economies are in a floating exchange rate relationship to the US. They are not pegging to the US dollar. Some of them may be in pegged regimes with respect to, say, the euro, like Denmark, for example, or de facto in those kinds of pegs. But here, most countries are floating against the dollar. So what's going on? I would say, and I think Maury would say the same thing here, is that this is not evidence against the trilemma for a variety of reasons. First, as we already noted in the illustrative evidence at the start, global as opposed to local shocks will induce even floats to sometimes implement the same policy as the base. So the average treatment effect will be polluted by some of those correlations, at least in small samples, unless we have some truly immaculate identification or we have a super large sample, and we don't. Second, if the floats are partly managed and not 100% pure floating, that too will pollute and induce a correlation with the base. And we know that exchange rate concerns are often present even in advanced economies. For example, in the UK, where there's an important component of inflation that's driven by import prices, and so the central bank has to, if not explicitly, at least implicitly factor that in to their policy choices. So that's going to, again, tend to give rise to some kind of pass-through from the dollar. Third, some of the influential results in the dilemma debate, starting with Ray's paper, have been focused mostly on a DM sample. And so, that raises the question of, do those results translate as easily into the EM context? The choices are very different there, and we've already heard from other speakers that they have very different dynamics. So we can't really test the trilemma in this way, important as these results might be for the DM countries. What we really need is a clean empirical design that asks side by side for a given well-identified US shock, monetary or financial, what happens in response in the same period in two plausible treatment and control economies, one pegged, one floating, which are in other reasonable respects valid candidates for the comparison. Now that's a lot to ask. That was a long sentence. But we've been making progress on that, and various research has contributed to that, including by Maury and Jonathan Austrian, co-authors at the IMF. And that's what I'm going to focus on in what follows. So an interesting contribution is here from Shebnem Khalel-Mioskan's paper at Jackson Hole in 2019. It wasn't the main focus of her paper, but I think it's a terrifically interesting result. Just showing that here for financial shocks from the VIX, how do they correlate with outcomes in emerging economies? And on the left are managed floats, on the right what she calls free floats. So she's got, again, a binning of countries based on exchange rate flexibility. And she found an incredibly strong correlation in the more fixed regimes, the managed floats, and very little correlation among the free floats. So I want to drill down a little bit further in that spirit in the time remaining and give an overview of three pieces of research, some with co-authors and some on my own now, to try and give you a little flavor of what I think is the direction of research. So here's some work with James Klein and Patrick Hurtgen. Klein is my colleague at Davis, Hurtgen of the Bundesbank. And we were looking at the experience of Germany and the European economies that were pegging to Germany under the European monetary system prior to EMU. Right? And you may ask, what's this got to do with emerging markets? But of course, as we've learned, a lot of peripheral countries in Europe act a lot like emerging markets. Nowadays, that's expressed through sovereign risk deviations. Prior to monetary union, it was expressed through currency risk, although we still see occasionally exit or redenomination risk bubbling up, for example, in Greece. So here, we wanted to compare shocks emanating from the US with another kind of shock emanating from Germany, the Bundesbank. For that, thanks to Patrick and he's based at the Bundesbank, he was able to get access to the archive and to the history of policy rate discussions and the forecasts that were being used. And for over 500 meetings, going back to 1973, we produce in this paper a new series of Bundesbank policy shocks that can be used as a complement to the existing long-time series of US monetary policy shocks in the spirit of Roma and some high-frequency identification approaches. And our exercise was to say, okay, now let's look across Europe. Let's pool together all the European economies, some of which were floating, maybe like Britain and Sweden, which were more towards the floating end. Others were more pegged. They were more committed to the EMS project and didn't vary their exchange rate as much, say Austria or the Netherlands. So we create that separation and we say, how do the shocks propagate? And the interesting thing is that it lines up with the trilemma pretty well. A Bundesbank rate increase was passed through to the EMS economies, led to contraction, led to disinflation with statistically significant effects. Those are the blue responses here across the 8 categories of outcome variable. Dollar rate increases, like US monetary policy shocks, hardly passed through at all. The responses were sometimes in the opposite directions, mostly insignificant, and sometimes just looking like noise. So I think this is an interesting historical experiment. It's as close as you can get to the apples-to-apples comparison. You've got 2 major central banks, the Bundesbank and the Federal Reserve. You observe their shocks, and you can see how do the same economies respond to each. And I think that's a very revealing experiment, and hopefully you and the referees will like that paper. Second of all, I thought I'd do something original just for this conference and went back to the Ilzetsky, Reinhardt, and Rogoff exchange rate regime classification. And I decided I would split it up into 3 bins. I would call the ones with an exchange rate regime categorized as 11 or above here, the blue, as floating. I'd categorize anything 10 and below as pegged, and 6 and below I would call a hard peg. So here you can see that it roughly divides the sample up into equal-sized bins. And I'll ask, how do policy rates for emerging economies over this sample, which is, these are the emerging economies from, you can't see it because the font is so small, 1991 up to 2019. How do emerging economy policy rates, using the BIS data set, respond to Fed shocks in this period? Okay. And what do we get? And here I do it 2 ways, OLS and with instrumental variables. So OLS is just regress local policy rate change. I'm going to use the 6-month Treasury rate, which I explained before was my preferred measure to avoid the zero lower bound problem in the 2010s. And OLS is just a straight regression. IV uses Swanson's high-frequency surprises to Fed policy as an instrumental variable. And what you get here is, again, something quite sensible. The coefficient is close to 0 for the floating category. For the pegs, it's 0.157. For the hard pegs, it's 0.592 and significant with OLS. Applying the instrumental variable, which maybe you should, and the coefficients rise. For the floating countries, 0.38. For pegs, 0.77. And for hard pegs, the pass-through is now above 1.59. So,
if you could bring it to a conclusion.
Right,
please.
a couple of minutes. The last piece of evidence will be from a student of mine who's now at the Kansas City Fed, Johannes Matschke, and he was looking at the spillovers from financial shocks, here measured by the VIX, into emerging market economies, again, dividing them up, peg versus float, and also open versus closed, in line with the categories inside the trilemma. And again, he found results that kind of line up with the standard prescription. Here you can see that for financial spillovers into stock returns, looking out over a horizon up to 8 quarters, for the pegs in yellow on the left versus the floats, the pegs suffer severe drawdowns in their stock markets, strong transmission. The floats suffer a drawdown for a brief period and then a bounce back. Not so much of a difference between open and closed on the right panel. His next figure, housing markets. This is total return to housing. Again, pegs see real housing downturns that are much more slow-moving and persistent. We know that the housing asset price is much more slow-moving. And so you've got a big housing crash transmitted into the peg economies. For the floating economies, much less so. Things just kind of move along benignly. Last piece of evidence, transmission to credit growth. Credit growth stalls in pegs and floats, but it recovers in floats after about 3 quarters. In pegs, credit remains in a credit crunch for much, much longer. So to conclude, I think the lessons of the trilemma still endure. And I want to make just a handful of points here. I've been careful to stress that when we look at this question, we need to take into account the difference between the very distinct cases of DM and EM economies. And I think a lot of the debate, but with some important exceptions in recent years, has been mostly talking about the DM. They are structurally different policy frameworks, different degrees of credibility, different degrees of financialization. And I think the main message is that even in the DM world, where we can get a good empirical design and a clean experiment, the example I gave of Germany and the US, there's still evidence in support of the trilemma. And in EM countries, if anything, the evidence is perhaps even stronger, with spillovers from the US being much more powerful into pegged economies than into floats, whether measured by interest rate transmission, GDP outcomes, stock markets, housing markets, or credit. And I think that leaves us with a lot to be concerned about at the current moment, that the hiking cycle we're in could transmit adverse shocks across the world into EM and DM. But that being said, I think the countries that are able and willing to embrace exchange rate flexibility should be able to better insulate themselves from the turmoil that lies ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating and extremely relevant for the times that we currently face. Our next speaker is Adnan Mazarei. He's currently non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Previously, he was deputy director of the IMF, worked intensively on resolving various financial crises in emerging markets, and is extremely well placed to be on this panel. And without further ado, we very much look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to be with you. Up to now, starting with Maury through to Alan, people have described some of the risks and the policy context in terms of global financial stability. My assignment is to discuss the global financial safety net, their governance, and how they're going to be affected by various geopolitical trends. In addition to the geopolitics affecting the safety net, they will also affect capital flows in important ways themselves. For example, it won't be any secret to people that large investors, such as sovereign wealth funds, are working hard to sanction-proof their portfolios. And their investment space may change over time, okay, with implications for concentration of risk, let's say. What are the issues with regard to the safety net? First, what is the safety net? I define it here as others do: resources and frameworks used to address short-term macroeconomic problems. What should it cover? this is a controversy. People don't necessarily address it as such, but it is a controversy. By calling it the global financial safety net, it obviously implies, at least to me, that we're talking about short-term financial risks and liquidity issues. Others may have a broader definition of the safety net. For example, issues of global goods such as financing of vaccines, fighting climate change, etc., etc. Okay? So we have to have in our mind, and certainly the shareholders of the major institutions have to have in their mind, what is it that the institutions that they control should deliver, and how should there be, if any, a division of labor among them. The next question is, how much should the safety net be? And I'll go over some of these issues. What should be its structure, and how it should be governed? Now let's see, maybe I shouldn't be trusted with this, but here we go. Conventionally, the global financial safety net is defined to have 4 components: reserves, bilateral swap lines, and regional financial arrangements, and finally, the IMF. Notice when we call this global, this doesn't necessarily mean everything is controlled for global purposes. For example, reserves are the reserves of individual central banks, and that is the actions they take, which may have an impact, good or bad, on other countries. The multilateral components are the last 3. Okay? This conventional definition, of course, misses 2 things. One, many of the multilateral development banks who do provide liquidity services, for example, as Mr. Mukhabrai was speaking with regard to the Asian Development Bank. But these functions are not easily separable on their balance sheet, let's say. Next, there are some central banks that do stuff for, especially of the reserve currencies, that take some steps to preserve their own financial system, which effectively help solve global financial problems. For example, the Federal Reserve announcement that it will support the US municipal bond market without even interfering, or without there being any transaction associated with it on the Fed balance sheet, does help this global dollar market, and therefore, in some ways, is part of this. The global financial safety net's composition and size have changed over time, but this is mostly because of the buildup of individual countries' global reserves, which means they have taken it upon themselves to self-insure. Okay? Compared to the world GDP, the global financial safety net has been rising. By another measure, which is the global financial safety net as measured in the end of 2020 by the fund, was about 18.5 trillion. That compares with the world GDP of about 100 now. And it compares to a financial stability board definition of global financial assets of about 470 trillion. That's about 4%. Therefore, for me at least, I don't know what is the proper size of the global financial safety net. Okay? I have some better ideas about the funds, the adequacy of the funds, resources, but having said, confess that I don't know what the proper metric is, and there are lots, as I mentioned a couple. I do know that not all countries and regions are covered adequately by them. So even though there is a huge size in terms of global financial stability net, for example, Africa is not very well covered. A major component of the safety net is bilateral swap lines. They have grown in number. The last count is 91. but these are sometimes overlapping, sometimes uncoordinated among themselves, and certainly with the IMF. And there's an element of competition among them. Most recently, the BIS has started a renminbi liquidity facility, which I understand also includes dollars. It includes 5 Asian countries, but one that is very far from Asia, namely Chile. Okay. For me, this is an indication of a groping by the international community and various institutions to fulfill some sort of a function, not just because they want to have a function, because there's something not working properly. The adequacy of the funds, the RFAs, also depend on 2 things, and I will go over them if there's time. First, one that I will not go over, which was done this the morning by Tobias Adrian, is how the fund and others frameworks for capital controls are going to work. Okay. For me, there's of course historical evidence of how some capital controls have worked, but now as a almost sanctioned policy approach by the IMF, it may become more prevalent, and I don't know how it's going to serve. But the efficiency and effectiveness of that framework is going to decide how much, whether the safety net is adequate or not. Another issue, which I will get into, hopefully, is the global debt resolution framework. Okay. How much you need in terms of a safety net depends on how investors in advance think that if there is a debt problem, the international community's frameworks are going to work well, preventing a need for rushes to exit, etc. The effectiveness of the safety net is very closely, obviously, related to its governance. Here, I define governance as who controls what, how much control they have, who gets what, and at what price or under what conditions. Governance issues will also, of course, have an impact on the individual components of the global safety net, whether they be the bilaterals, whether it be the multilateral approaches. Okay? Governance issues, of course, are going to become much more critical as we go forward because of the geopolitical fragmentation we face, and frankly, for the implications it has for the G20 as a framework. At the heart of the IMF's governance and legitimacy are the issues of quotas, which I will go into more detail in a while. It is well known that there are disparities between what are the shares in the fund of the various countries and what they think they should be. They have different measures of legitimacy of the institution in their mind. For example, I'll go over the quota formula very briefly. Some countries think that there should be greater weight on the GDP. Some people think there should be a variable in there called population. For example, India and China together will soon have about 30% of the world's population. They have about 9% of the IMF quota share.
Another 4 minutes.
Pardon me? 4 minutes. I'll be very, very quick. You sold some of my share to Alan, I see. The various components of the IMF resources are quotas, NAB, new arrangements to borrow, and bilateral borrowing arrangements. The quotas are the most stable one. The new agreement to borrow is an agreement about close to 40 countries for borrowing if 85% of those countries participating agree, which means in a difficult moment, 15% or plus could block that. So that part of the global financial safety net in a moment of need may not be available. The bilateral borrowing arrangements are going to be reviewed next year, and there is no guarantee that they will be extended. The fund could borrow in the market. It is permitted by its articles of agreement, but in the past, shareholders have made it very, very clear they're not inclined. The fund could get some resources from major central banks in the form of swaps. Major central banks have made it very clear up to now they're not willing. Of course, as we go forward, this whole issue of resources is going to be affected by what the fund uses and who it lends to. The name Ukraine may pop up in some minds. And to what extent the fund, again, gets involved in the provision of financing for global goods, such as food security, which is more understandable, but some aspects of climate change may not be. Now, the IMF quota formula consists of 4 variables in order of importance: GDP, openness, volatility, and the size of a country's reserves. GDP is a blend of PPP and market exchange rates. Of course, when you have a variable in there called openness, it is highly favorable to countries that are small and very open, indulging in a lot of, for example, re-export. This means small northern European countries and, let's say, Singapore. There is going to be there is in process a 16th review of quotas of the IMF. The 15th review concluded without success. Okay? The success of this is going to depend very much on political give and take. Okay? This debate could entail an increase in the size of the fund's overall envelope, which is about close to $1 trillion now, the resources available. It could raise quotas, which are the more stable and long-term and the truly multinational part of the resource safety net, at the expense of the new agreements to borrow or the bilaterals. Now, a couple of quick words on multilateral development banks. Depending on what the shareholders really think these international institutions that they own should contribute, there could be a shift in a burden of production of these goods from one institution to another. There is general recognition of the multilateral institutions, development banks needing more resources for the various reasons that you can think of, climate, etc. Several issues are at play there. One, whether there should be an increase in capital of these banks. 2, whether there should be greater willingness by the institutions to take risk. For example, the World Bank is very much focused on keeping its AAA rating. People have said if you reduce to AA, its cost of financing will only go up by 20 basis points, so why not? Another component of this will be the issue of guarantees. Let's say the World Bank provides guarantees for investments to a country, but its prudential practices require full scoring in terms of provisioning as if it were a dispersed loan. Now, that could be softened a bit, but I think there is some give and take that could happen there. Some things I highly doubt will happen. For example, one suggestion is for these banks to have callable capital, which I find highly unlikely for the major shareholders to accept. In summary, I think the global financial safety net, as I could tell it, maybe is enough. Its components are problematic in terms of coverage, coordination, and some competition among the various players. geopolitics is going to make the effectiveness of this more difficult. The fund is perhaps the truly multilateral part of this, but its resources are hampered by the size of its quota relative to its overall firepower. So for the fund to be able to do this work better, its quotas need to go up perhaps at the expense of other things. Big give and take should happen on the politics, which I find hard to happen. For example, the likely losers in a quota redistribution will be Europe and Japan. In the current world setting, I cannot see the Europeans giving too much of their power away, be it in terms of their quota or choice of the management of the IMF. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed for this sobering assessment, and what Adnan doesn't know about this is probably not worth knowing. We now have two discussants, and I'd be grateful if you would stick to maximum 10 minutes each, and I'll give you a little warning just before that runs out. Our first discussant is Choi Woojin, an associate fellow at KDI.
Thank you. I'm Woojin Choi from KDI. I would like to give my opinion regarding the talk, Monetary Policy Spillovers After the Pandemic by Alan Taylor. He's my an advisor and a co-author at the same time, so it's an honor to discuss his talk. As usual, the views expressed here are those of mine and don't represent the views of the KDI. So, to cope with international shocks, various instruments have been recommended. This morning, even we saw capital flow management is conditionally partly endorsed by the IMF. The foreign exchange intervention is come forefront of the policy instruments, and one economy can also engage in macroprudential policies. And foreign exchange swaps has been discussed quite a lot recently in Korea too. So now there's various more instruments at the table, and but the key thing is the economic situation all around the globe is still quite disturbing. And Professor Taylor's talk, he revisited this international trilemma and asks, can floating exchange rate regime provide the first line of defense? So this is quite a very classic argument. It is generally known to be better suited for advanced economies, possibly less effective for emerging economies depending on the situation due to that dollarization or original sin. And as he said, quite a lot of challenges have been raised regarding the effectiveness of the trilemma or the effectiveness of the floating exchange rate system. Have the corners of these international trilemma triangle been rounded, and most importantly, is it dilemma instead of a trilemma because of the global financial cycle. And Professor Taylor argued that probably the international trilemma is still very effective framework to cope with these international shock transmissions. And I think this is really a timely presentation for Korea at this moment. Let me briefly remind you what the international trilemma is. So I borrowed this little triangle from the economist.com, and it virtually says that you cannot take all three points at the same time. So if one economy would like to enjoy the free international capital mobility and to engage in a monetary policy oriented towards the domestic goals, then one has to let its exchange rate float. You cannot stabilize the exchange rate like peggers. This is what international trilemma is about. And I really think that this trilemma matters in Korea at this time, at this moment. So again, I really think this is a timely and interesting presentation. This classic question returns to Korea. And let me explain why. This is a news article in the Bloomberg a couple of weeks ago. And the Bank of Korea Governor Lee had already signaled his preference for a more gradual pace of tightening given the impact of higher borrowing costs on record household debt, which is clearly an internal issue, and the gloomier prospects for the global economy. So monetary tightening in Korea is less aggressive than in the US, possibly because we have milder inflation. And at the same time, the exchange rate has been depreciated very sharply. Like mostly mentioned in this morning, its effective exchange rate is less depreciated, but still, if you look at just the last couple of months, it has been depreciated. And the foreign exchange intervention is, at least in my own opinion, is less aggressive than in days during the global financial crisis. And capital flow management has been very little since then. So this is, I really think this is a textbook trilemma situation right now. If you look at the interest rate differentials and the exchange rate, if you look at the interest differentials of the policy rates between US and Korea, or 3-year Treasury bonds yields between US and Korea, recently it's been narrowed down, and within a few days we might see the negative interest rate differentials. And then this Korea won US dollar exchange rate has depreciated quite rapidly for the last several months. So if you look at, again, it's strong dollar, and the effective exchange rate might not as rapid as the picture looks, but still it's depreciated for sure, and I think it really is a classic trilemma situation. Next comments. So there are some further relevant lessons for Korea. So in his talk, he provided an interesting new episode, especially German monetary policy shocks spillovers to other European countries. There are differences between peggers and floaters, and like a US versus German shock, which can be a global or local shock. And like these European countries, we are facing two large gravities, US and China, possibly. And to deal with these two different gravities, it's quite two different situations. US business cycle still very hot, especially still very hot, and while the import demand from Korea to China is sluggish. So it's more like a nuanced, multi-layered problem than just the global shock, probably mixed of these local and global shock altogether. So the question is, will the Mundell-Fleming adjustment be in place? Will the expenditure switching be large enough? Will this depreciated exchange rate insulate our economy from the further recession or something? And it's also true, it's possibly through some granular players like for like an export firm whose revenue is invoiced in dollars and the cost is invoiced in local currency, possibly an automobile industry. This depreciation could be beneficial. So this could be a player who will generate this expenditure switching. But still, there are quite heterogeneous effects on different firms. So we'll see what will happen with this trilemma situation. And lastly, I think this is the most important question for us in Korea. The key question here is that are we an advanced or an emerging? Or how much advanced is Korea? So like everybody might agree that we are in transition from emerging economy to middle income, and now we are categorized as one of the advanced economy. And the key question is, how or how much can the floating exchange rate regime insulate the economy? Or how much has the institutions been improved? Internal, external financial intermediaries, have there been improvement in this efficiency in terms of allocating resources? And now we are a net creditor with less severe debt dollarization. So what I'm trying to say is that the situation that policymaker faces today is quite different from 12 years ago. So it's giving us more complication, more difficulties to deal with this situation. And lastly, the authority in charge of monetary policy and the data of external account and exchange stability are different. So can we coordinate the policies altogether in an advanced economy way? That might be the key to our economic situation, I guess. And this is my own work. This is the U.S. monetary policy shock to the impulse response of the policy shock on the foreign capital flows before and after the global financial crisis up until the 2019. And as you can see, the blue solid line stands for the impulse response after the global financial crisis, and it's very muted. This result do not include the very recent couple of years, but up until the 2019, it's very muted and almost be like this is quite different, almost different institutions before and after the global financial crisis.
10 minutes are over.
Yeah, I just have one more slide. So summary and conclusion, I really think that it's an interesting talk. It's really interesting to revisit the classic trilemma, and it really matters at hand in Korea at this moment, I think. It seems to me that broadly Korea seems to pursue the classic lesson, let the exchange rate float and be the first line of defense. And exchange rate, especially for the last couple of months, it's been depreciated quite rapidly. And without any further instrument to actively utilize this, maybe we are advanced enough with better institutions. But still, there are challenges remain. Again, capital flow management, foreign exchange interventions, and the monetary policy, we need to coordinate these policy instruments very cleverly. And still, multiple gravities and the internal-external trade-offs still exist. And no severe capital outflows at 2017 US tightening. But will it matter at this time? This is going to be a big, essentially, what will determine the outcomes of a policy mix in Korea. And lastly, more details why adjustments. Clearly, the trilemma treats the advanced and the emerging very differently. And more details of why adjustment in the advanced and emerging market differs have to be explored. If economists has to explore this dimension, this has to be us, the Korean economists, because that's what matters in Korea right now. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for this excellent discussion and extremely pertinent set of questions. Our final discussant will be William Roos, Assistant Secretary at the French Treasury, Multilateral Development and Trade Affairs. Podium's yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation for the Korean Ministry of Finance and KDI. My comments will be related mostly to the presentation made by Adnan Mazarei. So I think the composition of the panelists is right to cover everything. Why? Because together with my Korean colleague Byung-sik, we are co-chairing the G20 International Financial Architecture Working Group. And we are in charge, together with all the G20 members, to have a sort of oversight regarding the global financial safety net. Of course, each institution has its own governance body, but where do we discuss about coherence, consistency between IMF, MDBs, data architecture, RFA, etc.? I think it's notably at the G20 and notably within this working group for the technical discussion. And if we look at what we collectively at G20 level we have done these last years, faced with different crises, COVID crisis, food security now, energy, etc. What we have done is mostly to add new instrument, so addition of instrument, a call to mobilize all the financial institutions for them to deliver. But it's probably true that we have not taken a step back and looking at the consistency of the global architecture. And I think there is an appetite for many G20 members and outside also the G20 to look at the global architecture as a whole. If I go in the three main elements, GFSN, debt architecture, and MDBs. Regarding GFSN, of course, first IMF at the center. What we asked IMF to do and what we decided collectively due to, in the context of the COVID crisis was to make this general allocation, this very big exceptional general allocation of 650 billion. So clearly we used the IMF instrument in a quite innovative way, I think, to provide liquidity to all countries. So a direct impact for all countries, but of course we had to take into account the fact that the SDRs were not distributed exactly where the needs were the biggest. And it's due in a way to the discussion about quotas. But I think we understood that quite quickly and progressively at within different fora, we built this political momentum to mobilize 100 billion of these SDRs in countries where they have a strong external positions, no need for specific SDRs, to channel these SDRs to an institution where it could be used to support vulnerable countries. So there is today this 100 billion objective, and IMF offered us a good support with first supporting the reform of the PRGT, so a concessional support for low-income countries. And also, we decided, together with IMF, to build a completely new fund, the RST, Resilience and Sustainability Trust, to top up IMF program and to address climate issues. And you could say, climate, is it for IMF? And it's a key question. I think we have been pragmatic. We have legal issues regarding channeling SDRs, and it was much more simple to build the RST in the IMF. But of course, we wanted to fix that because we know that the World Bank is also very active, of course, regarding climate, and there are a sort of cooperation between IMF and World Bank for the climate assessment. So what is important today regarding this channeling of SDRs is now it has to be delivered on the ground, because we have talked a lot, and now we need to operationalize the RST, and the IMF is working hard for that, for making this trust fund active before the end of the year. Of course, we also asked IMF to mobilize emergency financing on top of the IMF program in the COVID context. But now I think it's the good moment to look at the IMF toolkit, and the IMF also is interested in discussing with us about the IMF toolkit, the relative place of emergency financing versus upper credit tranche program, the role of precautionary instrument, and So we have ongoing debate, and I think it's the real moment to have this with this broad view. And of course, in parallel, we have the quota review discussion. If I can summarize very quickly, we have to address the size of the IMF. At this stage, I think IMF is not at its full power, so there is room for delivering more if there is demand. But indeed, this question of size is important, and the question of alignment. And of course, behind that, you have more technical questions like the composition, the formula, etc. Where is the mood today for having a success or not? The feeling we have is that there is a mood for a success. Perhaps a modest success, I don't know, or an ambitious success, but at least a success. This is for the GFSN and notably IMF. Regarding debt architecture, in the context of the COVID crisis, we felt the need to do something different because we had to take into account that the composition of sovereign debt has changed, and notably the very important role of China, the size of China in the official creditor landscape, and also the importance of private creditors for many countries. And so for official creditors, the key challenge is coordination. In the past, we were not used to have a clear coordination between official creditors from the Paris Club and the other official creditors. And I think we have built new things to improve this coordination. Regarding private creditors, I think there are two different directions where we are working. First is based on the progress made regarding contractual arrangements, the CACs, in order to facilitate restructuring. Could we do more, and notably for syndicated loans? It's a very important avenue. And I think there is also a very important point, which is how to implement the comparability of treatment. When there is a debt treatment delivered by official creditors, how to be sure that the comparability of treatment will be enforced. This is the main elements. What we have done concretely, I think we provided first in a coordinated manner with the G20 Paris Club creditors and the other G20 creditors a liquidity relief and the debt service suspension initiative. It has worked quite well, not perfect, but quite well. So first example of coordination. And we also address a structural issue through the common framework in order to be able to do a real debt treatment based on an IMF program. We are making progress. We need to deliver. And the common framework is only for low-income countries, so we have also to improve our coordination for the other countries. And finally, my last point on MDBs, but I think I don't have so much time. I think there is a clear sense that we need to mobilize more MDBs because we understand that they have to continue to address developing issues, developing challenges, poverty, etc. And for that, usually MDBs can work independently, even if there are some country platforms, etc. But more and more, we ask them also, on top of that, to address global challenges, like, for example, climate. And for climate, the way they have to work with notably middle-income countries, emerging countries, is completely different. They have to work in a very integrated mode. And just to give you the example of the Just Energy Transition Package for South Africa, it's all the different institutions plus the bilateral player, the country, some donors, working together. So it's a different way of working. And we are asking more and more for MDBs, and so we know that we have to give them space to mobilize new financing. The first line is balance sheet optimization, capital adequacy framework. So many things are undertaken. in that direction. I think it's a key request from shareholders to be sure that we have done a lot of things on that. And then perhaps there will be a specific discussion on capital increase afterwards. So it was just to give you a very quick picture of the agenda we have today.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating window on what's happening on the G20 front. We need to conclude at this point. I believe you'll agree this was a fascinating, wordy, but fascinating panel. And I'd like to thank the speakers and panelists very, very much for making it so. Thank you.
Thank you, and also we had the wonderful moderator, and thank you so much for your active debate to exchange your opinions and knowledges about the financial industry. Thank you so much for your discussion. So now we'd like to take a short break, but we will continue the session 3. So please take your short break and be seated prior to before we start the session 3. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.